All right, welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're jumping into one of the most radical transformations you can imagine: how the United States went from being a nation of farms to a global industrial powerhouse in just over 30 years. Now, this wasn't just about building a few factories. This was a complete rewrite of America's economic DNA, and it happened at a speed that's honestly kind of hard to wrap your head around today. So that's the big question, right? How on earth did this happen so incredibly fast? What were the key ingredients that came together to light this industrial firestorm? I mean, to really get the scale of it all, just look at this contrast. In 1865, America is this patchwork of local economies. A farm in Ohio and a workshop in New York are basically in different worlds. Fast forward just 30 years, it's a single interconnected industrial machine. This wasn't some slow, steady evolution. No, this was a full-blown revolution that built the foundation for the America we live in today. Okay, so where do we even start with a transformation this big? Well, the first huge push on this industrial flywheel was the railroad. And you have to think of it as more than just trains. It was like a brand new nervous system for the whole country. And the scale here is it's truly mind-boggling. In the decades right after the Civil War, the amount of railroad track in the country increased fivefold. Just let that sink in for a second. We're not talking about adding a few lines here and there. This was weaving a massive steel web across the entire continent, connecting places that might as well have been on different planets before. Now, this massive build-out didn't just happen by itself. The federal government gave railroad companies over 170 million acres of public land. This was a gigantic subsidy, basically taking the financial risk out of building these lines into the huge empty West. It was a huge, deliberate choice by the government to forge a national infrastructure. So what's the big takeaway from all this new track? For the first time, you have a single, massive American market. All of a sudden, a factory in Pittsburgh isn't just competing with the guy down the street. It's selling its products in San Francisco. This just blew the doors wide open for mass production on a scale nobody had ever dreamed of. All right, but a new engine like this, well, it needs a much stronger frame to handle all that power. And that frame, the actual skeleton of industrial America, was forged from a revolutionary new material: steel. You gotta remember, before this, steel was basically a specialty item, super expensive, slow to make, really just used for things like fine tools. The game changer was the Bessemer process. It completely flipped the economics of steel. It didn't just make steel better, it made it possible to produce enormous quantities of it, and cheaply. And what's wild is how simple and incredibly fast the process was. Something that used to take a whole day to make a tiny amount of steel could now be done in just a few minutes. It just unleashed this flood of affordable, high-quality steel that was about to literally build a new America. The arrival of all this cheap, strong steel literally reshaped the American landscape. It meant heavier, safer rails that could handle bigger, faster trains. It meant we could build massive bridges across rivers that had always been major obstacles. And, maybe most importantly, it gave us the structural framework for the very first skyscrapers, completely changing what a city could look like. Okay, so now you've got this country physically stitched together with steel rails. But that creates a whole new problem, right? How do you run a business that has operations in New York and San Francisco at the same time? Sending letters back and forth by train just wasn't going to cut it. The speed of information had to catch up to the speed of everything else. And boy, did communication tech explode to meet that need. First, you get the telegraph, then the transatlantic cable connecting continents, but then the telephone arrives, and its adoption rate was just unbelievable. Over 50,000 phones in just 4 years. That tells you there was this desperate pent-up demand for instant communication. And that's the absolute key here. This incredible compression of time. Business decisions that used to take weeks of writing letters back and forth could now happen in a matter of minutes over the phone. This is what made it possible to efficiently manage these huge, complex, coast-to-coast companies that were they were totally impossible before. But there was one more piece of the puzzle: the ultimate accelerator. The thing that really made the industrial flywheels spin like never before was electricity. This was the innovation that just rewrote the rules of production. I mean, think about it. Before electricity, you were basically a slave to the sun. When it got dark, work just stopped. Electric light just shattered that barrier. All of a sudden, you could run a factory 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This wasn't just a small improvement.
It was a total reinvention of time, of labor, and of manufacturing itself. And this wasn't just about light bulbs and factories. You pair this new power with the railroad network, and things get really interesting. Take refrigerated rail cars, for example. Suddenly, you've got a national supply chain for meat and produce. It was a game changer that completely altered how and what Americans could eat, no matter where they lived. So you've got incredible scale, breakneck speed, and all this new complexity. The old way of doing business just couldn't keep up. You needed a whole new operating system for business itself. And to handle this new reality, these business titans came up with a really powerful new strategy. It's called vertical integration. The logic was pretty simple. If you want something done right, and you want it done cheap, you need to own every single step of the process yourself. Andrew Carnegie was the absolute master of this. He didn't just make steel. He owned the mines where the iron ore came from. He owned the ships and railroads that moved it. He owned the coal fields for fuel, and then he owned the mills. By controlling the entire chain, he controlled his costs, giving him a near unbeatable edge over everyone else. But what if you wanted to take that control even further? Well, for that, they invented something called the business trust. It was a really clever, and some would say sneaky, legal tool. See, on paper, it looked like you still had several competing companies, but in reality, they all handed over control of their stock to a single board of trustees, who could then run the whole industry like one giant monopoly. The goals here? They were brutally simple. For them, competition was just messy, it was chaotic. So the goal was to get rid of it. Control all the prices, maximize your efficiency through sheer scale, and create a stable, predictable market. This philosophy didn't just build companies, it totally reshaped American capitalism into something we'd recognize today. So when you put it all together, you layer all these things on top of each other, the railroads connecting everything, the steel building everything, the telegraph and telephones speeding everything up, and electricity powering it all 24/7, and you wrap it all in these new, aggressive corporate structures, you get the perfect storm. It was this incredible convergence that made it possible to re-engineer an entire nation in a single generation. And that really leaves us with a big question for today, doesn't it? When we talk about corporate power, monopolies, and market control in our own time, are we just hearing the echoes of these battles that began back in the Gilded Age? It just goes to show that the fights that started with steel rails and telegraph wires, well, they're still being fought today, just with fiber optics and algorithms.